The evacuation of Guangdong did not begin with a siren, and it did not begin on land. It began at noon on Friday in the South China Sea, when thousands of offshore workers, including crews on oil platforms, completed their evacuation from installations off the coast. 64 hours before the storm arrived, the first people moved were the ones furthest out. By Sunday morning, more than 801,000 people had been relocated in Guangdong province ahead of Typhoon Noul, the strongest typhoon to strike China this year, which came ashore near the town of Pinghai at 10 minutes to 4 in the morning, carrying winds of 162 kilometers an hour. Almost nobody in that province died. I've covered what that outcome means elsewhere. This report is about the mechanism. How does a country actually move 800,000 people in roughly 48 hours, finish before the weather closes the roads, and get them all somewhere with food and a floor? In the next 30 minutes, I'll take you through it as a system, the 4 separate emergency structures that were running simultaneously, the order in which people get moved, and why that order matters enormously. What happens to the boats? Who makes the decision about where the line goes on the map? The shutdown of an entire province's transport network as a deliberate safety measure, and the counterintuitive problem that Chinese researchers have identified as one of the biggest threats to an evacuation, which is too many people trying to leave. I'll also be honest about the parts of this that don't transfer, and the hazard the whole machine cannot touch. Let's start with something almost every English language report about this storm got wrong. There is not one emergency response for Typhoon Noul. There were 4, running in parallel, under different ministries, on different scales, covering different provinces. This is the single most misunderstood thing about Chinese disaster management, so let me lay it out properly. The first system is the meteorological warning. That is the 4-tier color code most people have heard of: blue, yellow, orange, red, with red the most severe. It is issued by the National Meteorological Center, and it describes the weather. Nothing more. It is a forecast product. The second system is the Flood Control and Typhoon Prevention Emergency Response, run through the State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters and the Ministry of Water Resources. It also has 4 tiers, but they run the other way, with level 4 the lowest and level 1 the most severe. This one describes what the state is doing, not what the sky is doing. The third system is the Geological Disaster Response, activated by the Ministry of Emergency Management. Also 4 tiers. This one is about landslides and slope failure, which is a completely different hazard from wind or coastal flooding and requires different specialists in different places. The fourth is the National Disaster Relief Response, activated by the National Commission for Disaster Prevention, Reduction and Relief. Again, 4 tiers. This one governs relief and recovery after the event. 4 separate ladders, all 4-tier, all active during this storm at different times, in different provinces at different levels. This is why coverage of Chinese disasters gets so confused. A headline saying China issues highest red alert and a headline saying China activates lowest level response are both accurate, describing different systems, and read together they look like a contradiction or a cover-up. They are neither. One is the forecast. The other is the mobilization. Now the timeline, because the sequencing is the whole story. Friday, the 24th of July, 2 days out. The State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters activated a Level 4 emergency response for flood control and typhoon prevention, not just in Guangdong, but in Fujian as well, the province up the coast. Note that the response covered the neighboring province before anyone knew precisely where landfall would be. Guangdong began shutting down its coastal operations. Passenger ferry routes in affected areas were suspended. Passenger vessels halted operations. And the Provincial Maritime Safety Administration set a deadline. Offshore workers, including those on oil platforms, would finish evacuating by noon. At the same time, rescue assets were pre-positioned. Vessels, helicopters, Tugboats and cleanup ships moved into place before they were needed, rather than after. Saturday, the 25th. 1 day out. By this point, around 340,000 people had been relocated in Guangdong. The Ministry of Water Resources activated a Level 4 flood control emergency response across 7 provincial-level regions: Fujian, Jiangxi, Henan, Hubei, Hunan, Guangdong, and Guangxi. That covers large parts of eastern, central, and southern China, and it flagged flood risk on some of the country's largest river systems, the Pearl, the Yangtze, and the Huaihe. Think about what that means. A storm that had not yet made landfall on the coast triggered flood preparations across 7 provinces, reaching 1,000 kilometers inland, on the basis that the rain would follow the storm north and west for days after the wind was gone. Also on Saturday, the Ministry of Emergency Management activated a Level 4 geological disaster response in Jiangxi and Hunan, 2 inland provinces the storm had not reached, while maintaining the existing geological response in Guangdong and Fujian. And on the water, 418 vessels were directed across jurisdictional boundaries to shelter in western Guangdong, in Hainan province, and in waters off northern Fujian. I want to dwell on that one, because it is the detail that tells you this is a genuine system rather than a series of local decisions. 418 boats were sent out of their own province's waters to shelter in someone else's. That requires provinces to accept each other's vessels at short notice, harbor capacity to be known and allocated centrally, and someone with authority over all of them to make the call. Saturday evening, the National Meteorological Center issued a red typhoon warning, the first red typhoon alert issued anywhere in China in 2026. Sunday, the 26th, 3:50 in the morning. Landfall, by Sunday, the relocation figure had passed 801,000. Roughly 500,000 people moved in the final stretch between Saturday's count and landfall. So how does that actually happen? Let me break the machine into its parts. Step 1 is drawing the line. Before anyone moves, somebody has to decide who is inside the danger zone. That is not a matter of drawing a circle around a forecast track. It is a hazard-specific assessment, which areas are exposed to storm surge based on elevation and coastal geometry, which slopes are at risk of failure given how saturated the ground already is, which districts flood in heavy rain because they always have, which structures are known to be vulnerable. Crucially, that mapping largely exists before the storm. It is maintained as standing risk registers at county and township level, updated after each event. When a typhoon forms, the work is not building the map. It is selecting which parts of an existing map to activate. That is the difference between a system and an emergency. An emergency invents the plan. A system retrieves it. Step 2 is the C, and the C always goes first. This is the part most coverage skips entirely, and it is where the highest risk population is. Anyone on the water, when a typhoon arrives, is in the most dangerous place available. Fishing vessels, aquaculture platforms, cargo ships, offshore energy installations. They cannot shelter in place in any meaningful sense, and they cannot be rescued during the storm because rescue assets themselves cannot operate in those conditions. So the maritime evacuation runs on the longest lead time, and it ran here on a hard deadline. Offshore workers off the platforms by noon Friday. Ferries stopped. Passenger vessels halted. Fishing fleets called in, with Jinhua drone footage on Saturday showing boats packed into harbor in rows at the Shenzhen Shanwei Special Cooperation Zone. And when local harbors filled, 418 vessels went to other provinces. Getting the fleet in early also solves a second problem. Every boat still at sea on Sunday morning would have been a potential rescue operation during the storm, consuming helicopters and crews that were needed elsewhere. Clearing the water on Friday is what makes Sunday manageable. Step 3 is the land relocation, and this is where the number comes from. The population being moved is not the general public. It is specific categories, identified in advance, and they go in a rough order of exposure. Fishing and coastal communities first, because they are lowest and closest. Then residents of low-lying districts subject to surge and flooding. Then construction sites and the temporary accommodation attached to them, and that category matters enormously for historical reasons I'll come back to. Then aquaculture operations, which sit on and beside the water by definition. Then anyone in structures known to be substandard, and residents of slopes flagged for landslide risk. Where do they go? Schools, gymnasiums, community halls, government buildings, designated in advance as shelters, and stocked before the season rather than during the crisis. That pre-stocking is unglamorous, and it is the difference between a shelter and a room. The mechanism that actually knocks on doors is the grassroots administrative layer, neighborhood committees, village committees, township cadres. Every residential area in China sits under an administrative unit with named people responsible for it. And those people have lists. When an evacuation order comes down, it does not go out as a general broadcast and hope. It resolves into a set of specific addresses assigned to specific individuals. That is the real answer to how 800,000 people move in 48 hours. Not a helicopter fleet. A very large number of people with clipboards who already knew which doors to knock on. Step 4 is the shutdown, and it is genuinely part of the evacuation rather than a consequence of it. High-speed rail across Guangdong was canceled for Sunday. Flights were canceled in large numbers, several hundred at Hong Kong International alone, with figures approaching 1,800 grounded across the wider affected region. It is easy to read that as disruption caused by the storm. It is better understood as a deliberate control measure. Stopping transport does two things. It prevents people traveling into the impact zone during the hours before landfall, and on a summer weekend on that coast, a great many people would otherwise have been arriving. And it clears the roads and rails for the evacuation itself, which needs the network more than commuters do. An evacuation running against normal weekend traffic is an evacuation that fails. Shutting the province down is how you give it room. Now the counterintuitive part, and this is the finding I found most interesting while putting this together. Chinese research on typhoon evacuation has identified a specific failure mode that has nothing to do with people refusing to leave. It is the opposite problem. Residents in areas that are actually safe joining the evacuation out of fear, driven by misunderstanding or a lack of information about the hazard. That has, in past events, interfered with evacuation orders and consumed resources needed by the people genuinely at risk. It makes sense once you see it. Shelter capacity is finite. Roads are finite. Buses are finite. Every family from a safe district that shows up at a shelter takes a space from a family whose house is in the surge zone. Panic evacuation does not add safety. It redistributes it away from the people who need it. This is why you see shelter-in-place orders issued alongside evacuation orders, as happened in Spain during the current European fires, where tens of thousands were told to stay put while others were told to go. Telling people to stay is not a lesser instruction. It is an equally important half of the same operation, and it only works if the public trusts that the distinction is real. Which brings me to the part of this that is genuinely different, and that I want to treat honestly rather than either praising or condemning. Evacuation orders in China are not advisory in the way they typically are in Europe or North America. When a district is ordered to relocate, compliance is expected and enforced. There is no meaningful equivalent of the American coastal resident who decides to ride it out. That is a substantial part of why the numbers work, and there is no point pretending otherwise. The single biggest cause of death in evacuable disasters worldwide is people who did not go. Removing that variable removes most of the fatalities. It also comes with everything that comes with a state that can compel people to leave their homes, and the same capacity applied to other purposes looks very different. I am not going to pretend that trade-off does not exist. And anyone presenting this as a straightforward argument for one governance model over another is selling something. What I would say is narrower and I think defensible. The specific capability of moving a large population out of a mapped hazard zone quickly is one that this system is unusually good at, and the results on Sunday are the evidence. There is also a technology layer, and it is newer than most people realize. During Typhoon Maysak earlier this month, drones were flown continuously over affected regions in southern China to restore mobile phone connectivity for residents cut off by flooding, effectively airborne cell towers, put up over places where the ground infrastructure had failed. Alongside them, the Ministry of Emergency Management deployed 1,372 personnel from the National Fire and Rescue Force, 270 vehicles, 140 boats, and 350 specialist rescuers. In Guangxi, the China Southern Power Grid ran an integrated system combining power network data, meteorological forecasting, and AI analysis to track that storm's path and rainfall distribution in real time, monitoring critical power infrastructure around the clock and pushing maintenance priorities directly to field teams. That last one is worth noting because power restoration is what determines how quickly normal life resumes after a storm. Predicting which parts of the grid will fail before they fail and staging crews accordingly is the difference between days and weeks. Now, what this machine does not solve. On the same Sunday that 800,000 people were successfully relocated from the Guangdong coast, 10 people died in a valley in Gansu province, 1,500 kilometers inland, when a mountain torrent came down a narrow gorge into a scenic area full of campers at around 2 in the afternoon. That was not the typhoon. It was a separate event caused by short-duration heavy rainfall in the mountains above the site. And it is the exact hazard this entire system cannot address. Everything I have just described runs on lead time. The mapping, the maritime deadline, the shelter stocking, the cadre lists, the transport shutdown, all of it assumes you know roughly where the danger is going to be, roughly when, at least a day or two ahead. A typhoon is visible on satellite for days. That is what makes the machine possible. A mountain torrent gives you minutes. The rain that produces it falls on one catchment out of hundreds, often out of sight of the people it will reach, and the water arrives somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes later. No clipboard, no cadre list, no shelter network, and no drone can operate inside that window. That is the honest boundary of what happened last weekend. A country demonstrated, at enormous scale, that it can get people out of the way of something it can see coming. And on the same afternoon, it demonstrated that nobody has solved the thing you cannot see coming. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the inland flood and landslide reporting across Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, Henan, and Shandong over the coming week. The geological disaster responses activated in Jiangxi and Hunan on Saturday were preemptive, and whether they were justified will show in what happens on those slopes now that the rain has passed through. The second is whether any of the 4 response levels are escalated above level 4. That is the clearest available signal that an assessment came back worse than the initial read. The third is relief funding. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan for Guangdong recovery, earmarked for roads, water conservancy facilities, schools, and hospitals. Watch whether it is supplemented. Funding follows damage more honestly than statements do. The fourth is the resettlement figures. 800,000 people were moved. The meaningful question now is how quickly they go home, and how many cannot because their housing is damaged. That number, rather than the evacuation number, is the real measure of physical impact. The fifth is the next storm. Noul was the 12th named system to affect China this year and the 3rd landfall in about a month. The machine has now been run 3 times in 30 days, and the peak of the season is August and September. I want to end with the detail that I keep coming back to. At some point on Thursday or Friday last week, in an office in Guangzhou, somebody looked at a forecast track and started selecting map layers. Coastal elevation, slope stability, known substandard structures, aquaculture licenses, construction site registrations. By noon on Friday, men were coming off oil platforms in the South China Sea by helicopter. By Saturday, 418 boats were being sent to shelter in other provinces' harbors. By Saturday night, an alert went out and the train stopped. And through Saturday and into Sunday, an enormous number of ordinary local officials went to an enormous number of specific addresses that were already written down and told the people there it was time to go. And they went. At 3:50 on Sunday morning, the storm arrived and found most of the dangerous places empty. None of that is watchable. There is no footage of it, and there never will be, because the entire product of the operation is an absence, the people who were not there. It is the least dramatic thing in disaster response, and it is the only part that reliably works. We'll be watching the inland figures.